Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Rebecca Tarlo, Becky. I'm part of the Friends of the MST, which is a national organization in the United States that works with the Brazilian landless workers movement, a social movement I'm going to talk about today. And I just want to say that the Friends of the MST is a national organization, but we have an LA chapter that was just founded a few months ago, and some of the founding members are here. So can you guys introduce yourself?
Michael, hi.
Karina. And then one of the goals of this talk today is to raise awareness about an exchange that's happening next year where 20 leaders of the Brazilian landless workers movement are going to be here for a year. And we're going to talk more about that exchange throughout sort of the talk in general and definitely at the end, trying to elicit your help. But we also have two host organizations here, which are organizations that have agreed to work with the Brazilian landless workers movement, activists and leaders when they're here. And so could you guys both, John and Peter, introduce yourselves and say your organizations? John and Peter.
Myself, I'm John Imani. I'm with Revolutionary Thomas in Los Angeles. We do the food program in America. Part that we've done for 7.5 years, feeding up to 150 people every Sunday.
Peter Coons with ACE, Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. We're a statewide community organizing group.
Awesome. So I'm really excited that we're all here, the people who are helping the MST leaders come and also the host organizations. And so today what I'm going to talk about is the Brazilian political context in general. I don't know if people have been watching the news, but over the past few months, hundreds of thousands of people have been out in the streets calling for the impeachment of the left-leaning Labour Party president, Dilma Rousseff. And so that's not where we're going to start, but that's where we're going to end today, understanding what those right-wing mass mobilizations are about right now. But we're going to sort of go back into history and look at social movements in general and the rise of them in Brazil, okay? But I really want this to be interactive, so if you have questions or comments or you just want to make reactions during the presentation, feel free, okay? And I also am from New Jersey, which means I talk Jersey pace.
Whereabouts in Jersey?
Trenton.
Yes. I'm from Camden County.
Camden, very cool. Central Jersey, South Jersey. So what I was going to do today is talk about 4 different historical periods that are really important to understand social movements and politics in Brazil. One is basically 5 centuries of landlessness and poverty, which ended with mass mobilizations of a bunch of new social movements emerging in the 1980s. And so I have some questions about sort of this period that hopefully we can talk about in small groups after the presentation. Then I have a section that's about social movements and the state. So since 2003, a left-leaning president, a left-leaning political party, the Workers' Party, has been in power for 12 years. And so what does it mean for these social movements that this left-leaning party has been in power? And so what are the complications and the tensions about a party founded within social movements taking power? The third area I want to talk about is the June protests of 2013. Have people heard of the June protests? Yeah? They called it the tropical spring, which is really obnoxious, but when the Arab Spring was happening and all these manifestations in Turkey, basically in 2013, more people than ever before took the streets in Brazil. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2013 protests and what they were all about. And then finally, the anti-workers party, which is the party in power at Brazil, and the protest of 2015, which we're going to call sort of right-leaning protest. I'm going to end there. Okay? Cool, so it's a lot of stuff, but I'm going to try to organize it in these 4 different periods and try to have very specific points about each period of time, okay? So, basically, Brazil is an agrarian country, which means that it's historically founded on farmers and agrarian production, and so to understand the history of Brazil, you have to understand the history of land concentration. Basically what happened is that when the Portuguese colonized Brazil, they created a system called Sesmarias, where they divided all of Brazil into 12 different regions, where one Portuguese captain owned all of the land in every region. And so that historical colonial context is really important to understand land concentration today. When independence happened in 1822, all of that land was supposed to be returned to the Brazilian people, called terra devoluta, or returned land. However, what happened happened is that all of the elites in Brazil, some of them national elites, some of them Portuguese elites, they actually created lots of false land deeds and were able to obtain ownership over that land. And they did this through a process that's called resignation, where you take cricket blood and you actually use cricket blood to make new land documents look like old documents. And so the term grilagem, cricketing, is actually a term for stealing land in Brazil. Of course, you can't forget that the other reason why there's landless in Brazil is that it had the largest slave trade in the Americas, larger than the United States. In fact, I think, what date was it? In the 16th century, black slaves constituted almost 70% of the labor force in Brazil. And so these Afro-Brazilians still are largely landless in Brazil. And finally, the Brazilian government realized they brought a lot of slaves in and the country was looking darker and darker. And so they were scared of that. And so they really encouraged white European immigration between the 1870s and the 1900s in order to whiten the country, right? So Brazil claims to be a racial democracy, but it's a deeply, deeply racially troubled country. And so they brought in all these Europeans to whiten the country. However, these were poor white Europeans who, when they were brought in, were not given land. They became landless laborers. And so you have this situation in Brazil where you have both black landless people and white landless people throughout the country.
I have a question.
Yeah, shoot.
Did they try to bring in European immigrants from specific countries?
Yeah.
Aside from Portuguese, like Germany, Italy, like did they target specific European countries?
Germany, Italy, and Poland.
Okay.
So the biggest, what's it called? Oktoberfest, the beer festival.
Yeah.
The biggest Oktoberfest out of Germany is in Brazil. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out to people the abolition of slavery in Brazil was 1888. And so my Brazilian tenants went up recently and I ran across something which was a fairly substantial number of Confederates after the end of the U.S. Civil War exiled themselves to Brazil, where slavery still existed for another 30 some odd years, and they still celebrate the U.S. Confederacy. They have like a little circle of people who are, descendants of these U.S. slave owners who went there.
An article just came out about that, right? The richest one that I was reading about. Yeah. Cool. So anyway, this history of landlessness created a situation where when industrialization started to happen in the cities, there was a sort of a mass exodus from rural areas, but in these new cities, poverty continued to exist. However, when there's landlessness, land concentration, urban poverty, what do people do? Do they just let it happen to them? No, they don't. They resist. And I think that's just an important point because in every single one of these eras, and I won't talk about that, but in every era, people have resisted this land concentration and poverty. And specifically in the 1940s and 1950s, the Brazilian countryside and cities was completely mobilized. Partially this was because the Communist Party came in 1822 and was founded and began to actually organize in urban labor unions.
1922.
1922, yes, that's what I meant. So the Communist Party came in 1922, and they began to organize within urban labor unions, radicalize these labor unions. Rural workers who actually weren't allowed to unionize went through a whole campaign where they started to organize and got their labor rights. And so by the early 1960s, there was so much resistance. There were peasant leagues. There were these literacy programs run through Paulo Freire, who's an educational theorist from Brazil. Everything was just up in uproar. They had succeeded in getting a very progressive person put in power, and it really looked like por fin, finally, there was going to be agrarian reform, and this history of landlessness was going to be transformed. And then what happened?
Coup.
Yeah, right? So because people were resisting and all this mobilization was happening, in 1964 there was a military coup, supported of course by the US government, and that coup lasted for 20 years. Yeah?
There's a new documentary, I don't know where it's shown here in LA, but in the Valley, they're showing it one of the homilies. It's basically a biography of that photographer, Sebastião Salgado.
Sebastião Salgado,
And
yeah.
he's, not that much of the film dealt with the dictatorship, but he was exiled because of it. And it did give some of the background.
Yeah, lots of people were exiled. Paulo Freire was exiled.
What year was this?
1964. And the Communist Party, almost all the Communist Party members had to go underground or they were exiled, but many of them went underground. And so it was a brutal dictatorship where political organizing was very difficult.
I don't know how to pronounce it, but Carlos Martigela and the mini manual of the urban guerrilla, where does that fit in time? Was that after the dictatorship, or were they?
His urban organizing? No, I think it was like in the 1980s, right?
Was it that late?
No, maybe it was before the dictatorship. Magalhães.
This is the popular.
I thought it was like published.
He was an urban guerrilla, yeah.
60s or so. whatever.
Yeah, people were reading it in the 60s.
Yeah. He was he's actually, there's a really famous phrase in the Landless Workers Movement's National School from Carlos Margalhães that says, "I didn't have time to be scared," or there wasn't time to be scared. But yeah, he was like an urban guerrilla warfare, yeah.
I would like to know, like, what is the relationship between this and my sort of impression of Brazil is this, very urban, libertine culture. I mean, like Black Orpheus is all I know about Brazil. A kind of what is it, Mardi Gras or whatever?
Carnival.
Yeah, Carnival, or basically anything goes, and what happens in Carnival stays in Carnival or whatever. A kind of very, very libertine atmosphere. What's the relationship between that and the sort of social and political movements that you're talking?
A relationship between Carnival
Yeah,
and social and political movements.
That sort of
Yeah.
general impression that, to me, is sort of the Western impression or the Northern impression of
Yeah.
Brazil, of this very libertine country.
Yeah. Well, I think Brazil, so there's like a few thoughts going in my mind, and I'm just going to say a few of them and then sort of move on, because I think we're going to get to the contemporary period soon. But a few thoughts is that Brazil is there's a lot of culture in Brazil. It's a country of many diverse peoples, indigenous peoples, different African peoples, different immigrants from Europe, and that's caused this whole entire sort of combination of cultural practices that have manifested in different ways. So Carnival is sort of this big celebration that happens. It's partially from the Catholic heritage. That's this huge party that happens in end of February, early March. In terms of this idea of it all just being free and everyone just having sex with everyone, I don't know if that's what you're... I think to some extent, Brazil, because it has a lot of Afro-Brazilians, a lot of people of color there, I think often it gets sexualized in ways that aren't actually true. Yes, I think Carnival is a big party. I think a lot of times it's actually tourists that come in and are having like the most fun there is. So I think Carnival for Brazilian people is about this deep cultural celebration of different practices and different dances, and I think it's sort of been sort of sexualized in the media in a lot of ways that are unfortunate. Yeah. But is it okay if we hold that and continue on to the contemporary moment? Because I'm also not even slightly an expert on Carnival. Okay, let's go back to dictatorship. So we're in 1964 and the dictatorship took over, which subdued what could have been a complete agrarian revolution. And what you have with the dictatorship is you have humongous growth. So between 1968 and 1974, the economy grew at an average rate of 10 to 11%. That is huge. And people called it an economic miracle, the decade of the 1970s. But you have to be really careful when they say economic miracle, right? Because the question is miracle for who? So while in 1960, the richest 10% of the population received 39.6% of the income, that same population received 50.9% by 1980. So it was a huge economic miracle, but what was happening is that this industrial growth was really going towards the richest sectors of the population. Meanwhile, in rural areas, you have what they call a green revolution. Again, it sounds really good, revolution, green. But what the green revolution actually was a shift back to export industrial agriculture, where you have monoculture, you have pesticides, and you have environmental degradation. This legacy is still with Brazil. In fact, Brazilian populations per person consume more pesticides than any nation in the entire world. And so this green revolution has serious public health implications. Meanwhile, you have huge migration to the city because what was happening with the Green Revolution is that the people who were previously farming were put out of work. So you have this huge migration to the city during the dictatorship, where in 1940, less than 32% of the population were in cities, and by 1991, 75% of Brazil's population is urban. So it's a huge shift to urban areas. And then you have situations like this, where you have huge industrialization and huge slums known as favelas. And so this divide between the rich and the poor during the dictatorship kept getting greater, right? Luckily, what do people do? Even during dictatorships, they resist, right? And so although the Communist Party was sort of underground and not able to be as active in this period, another actor came into the stage, and that was the Catholic Church. So in the 60s, the 70s, this is when liberation theology was coming really big, and the Catholic Church actually served as the organizational umbrella within which a lot of poor women, a lot of labor unions, a lot of peasants were able to organize within the church and within church study groups. Meanwhile, also in many dictatorships in Latin America, unions were just crushed and destroyed. But in Brazil, they were actually incorporated into the state and became the social service arm of the state. And they were what we call pelegos in Portuguese, like co-opted unions. So in contrast to these co-opted unions, in the 1970s, an oppositional union movement began to emerge. And so this was an oppositional union movement that was much more radical than these co-opted unions. And among this oppositional union movement, a new actor became really important. Does anyone know who that is?
Lula.
Yeah, right? So that's President Lula back in the day. And so the union movement became really important, and the oppositional labor movement that was founded was called the Central Union of Workers, or CUT in Portuguese. In addition, in the late 1970s, let me emphasize, still in the period of dictatorship, a lot of these progressive priests began talking to the landless workers who had remained in the countryside. In fact, there were a bunch of founders of the landless workers movement who were actually in seminary to become priests. And these priests told them, no, the most important thing for you to do is not to become a priest, but to occupy land. So under the guidance of these progressive priests, different dispersed groups of landless farmers in the southern part of Brazil began occupying land during the period of dictatorship, camping out on this land for years at a time, and actually pressuring the government to redistribute that land to landless farmers. I think this is really important to understand because later a law was created that actually legalized this land redistribution process. But the first land occupations of the landless workers movement were actually happening during the dictatorship. These dispersed groups of landless farmers eventually came together to form one united movement in 1984 called the Landless Workers Movement, or MST. And their phrase that they would use is land for those who work on it. And so they would typically occupy unproductive landed estates. So one landowner who has tons of land and doesn't grow anything on it, they would occupy that land, right? Finally, so we're still in dictatorship mode, right? Yeah?
Oh, I just had a question. Was there, what was the relationship between the Communist Party and the liberation theologists?
Yeah, so there was some relationships, but the Communist Party and the Catholic Church also, even the liberation theology ones, also had sort of different visions of social change. And so the Communist Party was actually not a really big actor in a lot of these social movements that were emerging in the late 1970s.
So this was largely led by liberation theologists?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely communist organizers there as well, but the Communist Party, at this point, to be honest, the Communist Party was co-opted in and of itself. And so it was working with a lot of the union movements that had become co-opted by the state. And so at this point, the Communist Party is not a radical actor. And that's actually a great segue, because all of the social movements and church leaders and peasant leaders decided that they had to form a new political party that actually had to adhere to these social movements. And so in the early 1980s, the Workers' Party, or the PT, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, was founded in 1980. And it was founded by leaders of the Union, Urban, Landless, and Radical Church movement as the party of the people. And it actually had a whole organizational structure that made it adhere to these local social movements through different nucleuses that would determine the direction the party took, right? So in order to understand the contemporary context and the conflicts that currently exist between these social movements and the Workers' Party that's now in power, you have to understand that all of these social movements were founded at the same moment. During the dictatorship in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Radical Church movement, the oppositional union movement, the landless workers movement, and the Workers' Party, which was going to be the party to represent them, right? So that's just a really important point. And so that's sort of the first period where I think some questions for this period are, what are the historical connections between these movements? What are similarities and differences between these different social movements that arose in the 1980s? What are the connections between contemporary social movements and social mobilizations before the dictatorship? I think in the early 1990s you have sort of a different, 1980s you have a different context emerging.
The peasant organization were like small landowners versus the MST, which was completely landless, or?
The ones in the
Yeah,
peasant
like-
leagues? Which one?
The CPT, is that a peasant group? Or?
So this is the church land movement.
Okay.
And that the church land movement was sort of they call it the mother of the MST. So it was radical priests organizing in the countryside. Yeah.
But were there movements of like kind of relatively small or poor peasants who had land but were different from the?
Well, there's also the rural union movement. So people who might be small farmers and are part of like the union movement. There's also over 75 organizations in Brazil currently that occupy land. So the MST is definitely not the only game in town. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't see well enough the one the symbol, the motor
That
on
one?
the motor left hand side. Yeah, what
That's
is
the
that?
anti-dam movement. So people who are
Oh.
displaced by dams, MABI, which is one of a huge social movement in Brazil and also found in this period. Sorry, Indes? Go.
Two people, it's okay.
Yeah, the only sort of radical political formation you've mentioned, besides kind of indigenous formations, is the Communist Party, and I'm wondering if you know anything about like the influence of other radical tendencies, like social democratic movements or Trotskyist movements or Maoist movements. Were they at all significant to have any influence on these developments?
Yes, every tendency you can think of is in Brazil. Like the Communist Party split, and there was a part of the Communist Party that sided with the Soviets, part of it followed China. There were Trotskyist movements, there still are Trotskyist movements. The Workers' Party, which is sort of inspired by all these different social movements, plus the Radical Church movement. So basically every tendency you can think of, like they exist in tension with each other in Brazil. And within the political parties, they have tendencies. So the Workers' Party has like 10 official tendencies that you can be part of. Yeah. And they have the social democratic movement is currently the quasi-neoliberal movement today. So so it's the Party for Social Democracy, and that's the one that implemented most of the neoliberal reforms in the 1990s. So things are all a little to the left of the U.S., right? But still the same sort of tensions. Yeah. Sorry, you had a question too, right there.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so if the Workers' Party was supposed to be the political party that's representing all of these movements, that's its intention. But is that accepted by these movements?
That's such a good segue for the for the next part, right? So what happened? Okay. So all these movements were born together, and they did have, like, all the founders of these movements were friends and organizers, comrades in struggle. But ever since the PT, when I say PT, I'm referring to the Workers' Party, which was founded, right? Ever since the PT took power in 2003, the relationships between these social movements and the state has become much more complicated, right? In order to illustrate these complications, I think there are complications that exist with all of the social movements and the state. But since I know, I should say that I lived in Brazil for 4 years, and I worked with the landless workers movement for 2.5. And so my experience is much more with the MST and their relationship to the state. So I'm just going to use the MST as sort of like an example of these complex relationships that developed once the Workers' Party took power at the federal level, right? Before I do that, I just want to say that the MST really has three main goals, and they're occupy, resist, and produce. So till to this day, the MST continues to organize land occupations that contest private property, which is sort of the bedpan or the center of liberal democracy, right? And so just so you get a sense of these land occupations, I wanted to actually show you an occupation that I participated in 2011, just so you can get a sense of what these occupations look like. And so this occupation happened in the northeast part of Brazil, which is more Afro-Brazilian, much poorer than the rest of the country. And basically what the MST did is they went to these urban areas in a very poor city. A lot of people living in these urban periphery areas had been farmers that had left their farms in the previous 2 decades. And so they began organizing with a car with loud music. Come to the corner on Friday, we're going to tell you about a land occupation. And so for a month, we went door to door, we knocked, we drove in this car, and every Friday these big rallies would happen where the MST would shout about the land occupation that was going to happen on April 17th, right? And even me, I had to go up there and be like, the United States is watching you, you're going to inspire people if you occupy land on April 17th. So that's how the occupation sort of played out. Then on April 17th at 4 a.m., the MST organized about 10 different buses that went to all these different poor periphery neighborhoods, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people with all of their things, their babies, their kitchen stoves, piled onto these buses to be part of this land occupation. And we all arrived at this plantation at 4:30 a.m. And the reason why I'm showing this video is because I think it actually shows you both how much the movement continues to contest private property directly, but also just the feeling of positiveness that the movement has during these occupations. So you can't see here, but there's like 1,000 people were part of this occupation, so everyone's behind us. And they could just jump over the fence, but part of sort of the MST's point is to break the lock as sort of a symbolic break. So he tries to break it for a while. I think they break it out. Okay. Anyway. So then at this point when he's breaking the lock, I'm filming and they're like, Rebecca, jump over the fence and film us coming in. So I jumped over and I took this really cool video of everyone breaking in the fence. And I just think it's important to see to see that it's both a direct confrontation in private property and also a very happy moment, right? So.
So they didn't have any security forces or anything to stop them?
That one didn't. Often they do, and often people have been killed before when this happens. The MST checks. Hold on, listen to this. What are they saying?
Occupy.
Ocupar, resistir, produzir. Occupy, resist, and produce, which are those three sort of points of the movement. Yeah, so the MST always sends scouts to farms they're going to occupy beforehand and find out if the security forces, find out if the farmers have hired gunmen, which often happens, especially in the Amazonian area. But this one, there was no security forces. And so basically what happens
There
is...
was an attempt after the occupation. I've heard that people do drive-bys after and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's so much violence depending on the situation, and they get evicted and they come back and occupy again and get evicted again, and there's violence and people get arrested. It's not like I share that happy moment to share sort of that feeling of resistance with everyone, but not to underplay the fact that it's a very, very sort of a dangerous thing to do, and there's a lot of people who have been killed because of it, right? So what happens after occupation happens is that day one, everyone comes with all their stuff and they just start building houses, because basically to get land redistributed, it usually takes 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 or 7 years. It's a huge bureaucratic process. So this is day one, everyone's there. And then day two, as the houses are set up, the MST starts organizing its internal structure. And so the MST calls their internal structure direct democracy, and a direct democracy is basically meetings, meetings, and more meetings. That is what it is, right?
Yep.
And so basically the structure is that the smallest unit in every camp, there's what they call a base nucleus of 10 families. And those 10 families send coordinators, a female and a male coordinator, to a camp coordinating collective. And that camp coordinating collective sends 2 coordinators to a regional coordinating collective. That regional coordinating collective sends 2 coordinators to a state coordinating collective. And then the state coordinating collective sends 2 coordinators to the national coordinating collective. And so it's what they call an ascending and descending democracy, where discussions happen in the base nucleuses, go up to the national directorate, and then come back down for more discussion. And so that's sort of the organization. And as soon as the camp happens, the MST leaders who are involved try to teach the new members of the movement about this organization on the ground and through chalkboards to sort of explain, right? And then for 5 or 6 or 7 years, they live on these camps and they just try to resist police force. And the price of resistance is pretty huge. 1,742 people, mostly peasant activists, have been murdered in Brazil because of agrarian conflicts. And so the biggest massacre happened on April 17th, 1996 in the Amazonian region, where military police gunned down a march of MST activists and 19 people were killed. And so currently April 17th is considered the International Day of Peasant Resistance in order to honor that day when those 19 activists were killed. So the resistance is hard, and it's not only hard because of violence, but because living in sort of makeshift tents for 5 or 6 years is extremely difficult, right? Finally, the MST, after it goes from these camps, this is actually an MST house. So you can go from like a tent camp like this to eventually having a structure. This is like a 25-year-old, what they call settlement. So in addition to occupying and resisting, one of the MST's big goals is production and agricultural production. So they set up a lot of collectives that deal with sort of the internal dynamics of the camp. So they have an agricultural production collective that tries to invest in agroecology. They have a communication collective that does newspapers. They have what they call a formation collective, which is internal political education, a youth collective, a gender collective, a culture collective, and a health collective. And the idea is in every settlement and camp, they have 2 people who represent each of these collectives, and those representatives have the same structure where they have a regional, a state, and then they have 2 people represented in the national directorate. So you'll have 2 people from each of the collectives plus 2 people from the state itself who are part of this national organizing structure. That make sense?
Yes.
Why do they use the word formation instead of education?
Because they also, great question, Karina. So formation for them is internal education that's not sanctioned by the state, right? And so that's internal political education. But in addition to that internal political education, the MST, since the very beginning, has also seen a need to transform the public school system itself. And I could talk, actually, my entire two years with the MST was actually with the Education Collective and looking at how the MST actually engages public institutions and transforms them. And so I could talk about that for like 3 hours. But basically what happened is when the settlements began to be created in the early 1980s, the government started building schools in the MST settlements and sending teachers to those schools who then taught the kids that their parents were illegal outlaws, that the movement was worthless, and that if they wanted to get a good job, they should move to the city, and that was the purpose of education.
Wow.
And so the MST realizes that it's hard to transform public schools within a capitalist system to adhere to socialist values. They're a self-identified socialist movement. However, they found that need, and so they attempt in every school in their community to also transform those school systems. But they see that as a very different process that's sort of a constant process of contestation with the state rather than their own political education, which they have complete control over, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to get back to, and this is actually a hard part of my presentation because I think it's complicated, but, so I'm going to use my notes a little bit here. But this is going back to your question about, now we have a left-leaning party in power since 2003. How have these relationships developed since the MST is a self-identified socialist movement doing these contentious actions against the state, right? And so, as I already mentioned, the MST was born in a period of military dictatorship. And this was probably the period when the MST's relationship to the state was most simple, right? The MST was against the state, it was against the government, and it didn't have any relationship. It didn't get any funding from the government. In fact, it was mostly funded by the Catholic Church and international solidarity groups. So this was a time when the MST, there was a clear line between the MST and the state, right? Now, in the 1990s, even before the Workers' Party took power in 2003, the MST's relationships to the state became more complicated. This is because, and I want to be clear, the MST is not the Zapatistas. They're not actually looking for autonomy from the Brazilian government, but rather they're demanding services from the Brazilian government as Brazilian citizens. Those include services to education, to agricultural, to youth, to agricultural technical assistance, to funding for newspapers, all these things. They're claiming these rights as citizens of Brazil. At a national congress, one of the leaders of the MST, João Paulo Rodrigues, explained the nature of the movement. We asked, so what is the MST? Well, can you explain its nature, its relationship to the state? And he explained it to us like this. He said, the first question to be clear on is the political nature of the MST. Some think of us as a big NGO or union, and some think of us as a political party. Our political nature has a lot of these elements, but we are a social movement, and our political nature is to negotiate with the government and to demand what our base needs. We have a responsibility to our base. He continues, when we interact with the state and government, we are still a social movement. Why do we not break with the state or government? The NGOs say they can say they do not receive money from the state. The NGOs can do this, but our movement cannot do this because we have a social base that has rights. And those rights are the responsibility of the government. So, as João Paulo explains, the MST believes that it's necessary to negotiate with the government to win concrete benefits for the populations living in areas of agrarian reform. They have a base of 1.5 million people, and they feel a responsibility to negotiate with the government for that base, right? This has created a lot of sort of interesting circumstances. In this picture, you're looking at a public school. A public school that has gotten the state to recognize the right of illegal encampments to have legal public schools within them, and for those legal public schools to be able to move with the movement of the camp when it goes on marches.
Wow.
And so here you have the state government recognizing a public school that is going on a march with the MST to contest that very same state. And so here, I'm not sure if the better description is that the state is co-opting the MST, or the MST is co-opting the state, right? I think it's very tricky. However, so basically in every single situation you'll ever be in, the MST tries to negotiate things from the state for its local citizens. We visited a settlement where the MST used our visit of 10 US people to actually bring the mayor in and make sort of demands for the settlement. And so it does this at every single movement. However, these relationships have gotten much more complicated once the Workers' Party took power in 2003, right? So the MST has an official position of autonomy from political parties. It's not associated with any party. In 1984, it decided that it was going to be independent of political parties. However, each election, national, state, and regional MST coordinating collectives decide what parties have been best for agrarian reform, and they often come out publicly in support of particular party candidates. For the Workers' Party at the national level, they did this in 2003 and 2007. 2003 and 2007 for Lula, and 2010 and 2014 for Dilma. They came out publicly in support. However, the MST, I'm going to be clear on this point, the Workers' Party has not supported agrarian reform. In fact, it has continued with the previous government's policies of market-based land reform, where you actually take a loan from a bank and buy up land that you're occupying. The MST doesn't believe in a market-based land reform. They want disappropriation. However, the Workers' Party has distributed almost no land in the past 12 years, despite its hypothetical support for the MST.
Is there any debate about compensation, or I mean, typically when these kind of seizures take place of capital, sometimes there's a position taken that it'll be done without compensation, or sometimes, like when we had the emancipation of slaves in the United States, there was no compensation. Sometimes there's no compensation, and sometimes there is. I'm wondering if there's any debate about that in Brazil.
For land occupations?
Yeah, exactly. But for the compensation to whoever owns the land for.
Oh, I get it. It depends on the situation and the state. Sometimes, often the state will pay the landowner a price for the land that they disappropriate. The MST is okay with that because that's the state paying for it. They prefer no payment to go. But it depends on the situation. Sometimes the MST occupies public land and forces the government to redistribute that, so the state doesn't pay itself.
But neither the PT nor the MST have a principled position on whether or not to compensate.
The MST believes that there should be disappropriation of the land without compensation.
Okay.
Because this land was stolen through this historical process, right?
They don't make an issue of it if the state pays the landowners.
Well, they're in this process of negotiation, so yeah, go ahead.
So you said that there have been no land redistributions under the
Almost no.
PT, but there have been like legalizations of land that was occupied.
Yeah, almost. There has. So between 2003 and 2012, the MST's numbers of people in settlements have stayed pretty steady, because although the government has taken land here and there, it basically has not done large-scale agrarian reform, while the previous president, who was actually this sort of neoliberal conservative, redistributed tons and tons of land through disappropriation, right? Since 2003, there's been little to no agrarian reform in Brazil. Nonetheless, this is a good segue, there has been concrete improvements for the lives of poor people in Brazil, because the Workers' Party has created lots of different social welfare programs that are not insignificant. They currently have the biggest cash transfer program in the world, which means that millions and millions and millions of people get automatically about $100 a month, so they're not starving, right? Bolsa Familia, exactly. They've also raised the minimum wage. They've done lots of different social programs. In the MST settlements, the MST is also getting more funding than ever before. It gets funding for technical assistance. It gets funding for schools. It gets all these different fundings, much more than the previous government, even though the government's no longer redistributing land. What's the contradiction? What's the contradiction? Anyone? The picture of this little map there?
Industrial agriculture.
Right. So, wait a minute. Yeah. I just want to use my notes because it's very complicated. So the contradiction is that the Workers' Party has given all this money to poor populations, has given more money to the MST than ever before, but has done this based on investing in the agro-industry model. And since 2003, when the Workers' Party came to power, the amount of sugarcane production, soy production, and international agribusinesses has just skyrocketed, right? So that's the contradiction. is that the MST now gets more money than ever before from the government for educational programs, for technical assistance programs, but it gets this money because of a reinvestment of the economic system that threatens the very existence of the movement, which is agro-industry. Yeah.
There has been a significant decrease in poverty in Brazil through mechanisms like the Bolsa Família.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That is one of the reasons why he's been reelected, why Lula's probably one of the most popular ex-presidents in all of Latin America, because what has been the actual decrease in poverty? I mean, it has been significant and measurable.
Yeah. The number of poor dropped from 50 to 30 million people in 6 years. That's 50%. And about half, they say, can be attributed to the growth of the economy, and half can be attributed to social programs. So.
I have also one other question. Yeah. What's the FFL-CIO have much of a presence in the social movements or any role with the labor movement there? And the FFL-CIO in Brazil goes way back, and it has played a significant role in solidarity with the generals and international capital. They played a key role in the overthrow of the Goulart government in 1964 with the Communication Workers of America and the American Institute for Free Labor Development.
Yeah.
The fate they replicated in Guyana and then in Chile some years later in '73 with the trucker strikes. Now the FFL-CIO abolished AFIL and its programs have improved immeasurably. But we know recently in Venezuela, the FFL-CIO has been up to its old tricks and that it was highly active in the right-wing social mobilizations against the Hugo Chavez government. Has there been any sort of relationship like that in Brazil with the AFL-CIO? I mean, if they have any presence at all, but they have been significant in right-wing mobilizations in Venezuela.
Yeah, I don't directly know that answer. My guess is that the AFL-CIO, if it has a relationship, it's with what was the oppositional labor movement, or the CUT, the Central Union of Workers, which is aligned with the Workers' Party government and is sort of in power now in Brazil. So my guess, the AFL-CIO probably has relationships to this once oppositional, now dominant labor movement in Brazil.
The CUT, affiliated to the, I know there's different CUTs around, but the one affiliated with the PT, is it an affiliate of the ICFT, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
The CUT?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on every aspect of Brazil, so hopefully we can share knowledge and learn. But the thing, what I want to emphasize here is just the fact that the MST is now getting more social programs than ever before, yet it's done based on this investment in an agro-industry model. And furthermore, the MST in 2006, not just the MST, but the women within the MST, decided to take a strategic change in their direction, and as opposed to only occupied unproductive land estates, they decided that the social good, so there's a law that says land can be redistributed when it's not being used for the social good, and previously that was defined as unproductive land, but the women actually decided, no, that includes monoculture production, such as Monsanto's and soy production and eucalyptus. And so the women in 2006 decided to the dismay of the male leaders, they decided to radicalize the movement, and they began actually entering monoculture plantations and destroyed some of the produce, right? And so that, for them, that was justified because monoculture production is part of the agrarian issue in Brazil. However, for the rest of the population of Brazil that had previously supported the MST, they no longer supported sort of destruction of private property. And so since 2006, the MST has lost a lot of their popular support. Furthermore, after this happened, the Workers' Party itself and CUT, the oppositional labor movement, had to sort of distance themselves from the movement because Brazil wants to sort of look good to international capitalists, so they couldn't condone this destruction of private property on these plantations. And so this has complicated the relationship between the state and the MST even more.
So the destruction of the monocropping is more about sort of
symbolic.
But eco-agriculture, I mean, they want to do multi-crops and more ecological.
Exactly, they support. So I should say that again. So there's two visions. You can call them two sort of liberal progressive visions. One is the vision of the Workers' Party, which is that it's okay to invest in large agro-industry and primary export, as long as workers in those agro-industries get paid well, as long as minimum wages are high, and as long as the government uses that income to redistribute to the poor people of Brazil, right? That's sort of a model of redistribution. The MST completely disagrees with that model. They don't even care about growth. What they support is food sovereignty, which is the right of local communities to produce culturally relative food, culturally relevant food through agroecological practices that allow for their community to be autonomous and not rely on this international food distribution, right? So those are two extremely different models, right? This, I think, is like one of the biggest contradictions you can see in not contradictions, tensions. Here you have the head of the MST education sector, Vander Lucia, and she's shaking Dilma's hand. Dilma Rousseff's the president of Brazil, because Dilma Rousseff just signed a law that's going to give more access to education in the rural countryside than ever before. Never before has the rural countryside seen so many resources. At the same time, on the stage is a woman named Katia Abreu, who is the head of the agribusiness lobby and a big affiliate of the Workers' Party, and she's the #1 enemy of the MST. She calls the MST a terrorist group. And so you can just see this contradiction. Wow. And it's not clear what direction to go in, right? Because here you have an example of where this money goes to. Here you have 100 MST activists that have gotten their law degree through a program funded through the federal government that gives access to university education through to people only in areas of agrarian reform, which are mostly sort of MST settlements and MST camps, for free through the alternative educational pedagogies that the MST actually created. And so you have 100 lawyers who are now activist lawyers that can go work for the movement, and they've done this through this federal money, right? And so basically how the MST describes it is they see public institutions as terrains of contestation. So every school, every university course, every federal program, they try to govern it and take control over it, but they realize that it's contentious. And in fact, within the movement in 2010, 50 leaders left the movement because they disagreed with the MST's relationship to the state. So it's not simple. There's a lot of tension, but I think we could have a really big discussion about social movement-state relations, right? So I've been talking for a long time, and I was going to go over the June 2013 protest and the anti-Workers' Party protest in 2015, or we could just stop and talk for a little while about what we've done thus far, because
mass mobilizations.
Mass mobilizations? Yes, Mimi?
I was going to say, could we hear a little bit about that? I mean, unless people mind, but I'd like to hear, I mean, if it's okay with you.
Are people still engaged?
We're still listening.
Still listening? Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're talking to the front, you can't tell if people are still. Okay, cool. Well, so basically, I think a lot of people have heard of this. That's June 2013 protest. But in June 2013, military police in Sao Paulo attempted to end what seemed like a sort of normal bus fare protest. So the most protests in Latin America across the board, across countries, is when bus fares goes up. And that causes the most protests because it affects poor people the most, right? And so military police tried to end this protest, and to their shock, through social media and widely circulated images of sort of the violence, 100,000 people showed up 5 days later on the streets, not only fighting for free public transportation, but also protesting the World Cup and calling for political reforms.
Where was this, in Rio? Or?
This is in Sao Paulo, but then it spread to Rio. And so in Rio and Sao Paulo, towards the end of June, there were hundreds, like 800,000, 1 million people on the streets, the biggest protest since the end of the dictatorship. It was huge. Yes.
Is there ever any sort of like direct action or this sort of thing in like Brasilia? Like in, you know, in
the capital?
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the MST just had its national congress in Brasilia, which was like 30,000 people, peasant activists camped out in the capital for 5 days. Yeah, so it happens. Yeah.
So these are not particularly MST, these are rural residents, people living in
Urban,
the big
urban.
I'm sorry, urban residents living in the big cities.
Exactly. So these mass mobilizations took everyone by surprise, including the MST, including the Workers' Party, including the Communist Party, every single organized movement. No one predicted nor organized these protests, right? Even the free bus fare, Transporte Libre, free bus fare organization, they didn't organize the hundreds of thousands of people that spread into the street, right? So the big question is, what was the cause of these protests? And I can't answer that question, but I can tell you what some people say. And I think Perry Anderson, have you heard of Perry Anderson? He's
UCLA.
Yeah, he's a great theorist who talks a lot about Gramsci and Marxism. And he wrote an article in 2012 that I actually think sort of predicted these protests, where he said that he's talking about the PT government and the extent to which the PT government has raised people out of poverty, but also been complacent with international capital, right? And he says, progress without conflict, distribution without redistribution, how common are they historically? And he says that in 2012. He says the sheer electoral weight of the poor juxtaposed against the sheer scale of economic inequality, not to speak of political justice, makes Brazil a democracy unlike any society in the North, even those where class tensions were once highest. The contradiction between the two magnitudes has only just begun to work itself out. He's saying that in 2012. Should passive improvement ever become active intervention, the story would have another ending. And so I think what Perry Anderson is pointing at in 2012 is that distribution of income to the poor without the redistribution from international capital is only possible when the economy is growing. And since 2009, 2010, the economy has sort of not grown as much as it was growing during the 8 years of the Lula party. So to some extent, these protests might have been an expression of the contradictions that were developing within the Workers' Party government. Nonetheless, when everyone took the streets, it took everyone by surprise, even the MST. These protests were a lot different than the previous protests organized by those social movements that arose in the 1980s. These protests were largely spontaneous, horizontal, leaderless in character. In fact, the MST said they tried to go to the protest and bring the MST flag, and they were told they weren't allowed to. People were very anti, not only the MST flags, but party flags in general. There was a feeling that this was sort of a leaderless, new type of social movement. A common catchphrase became, the giant has awoken, indicating an image of Brazil as a once dormant, politically disengaged country that was now activated and ready to organize their voice. And certainly this was true for some people. There were a lot of middle-class youth who were now more like lower middle-class youth who had never been involved in protests before that engaged in these protests. So was this a new moment of social mobilization in Brazilian history? People fall on different sides of this debate. In fact, the homeless movement, the MPST, which is perhaps the most active social movement in Brazil right now, I have a friend who went down and interviewed someone from that movement about these protests. And the movement leader said, Brazil has a long history of peasants, workers, and marginalized classes engaging in struggle. The giant never slept. That is, the Brazilian people who are most exploited have always resisted, but always within the context of a very strong state. So it's not, there was a lot of critique about calling these protests something new and suddenly mobilized, because for people who are marginalized in Brazil, they had been mobilizing since the 1980s, had been contesting homelessness, contesting landlessness, contesting environmental degradation. The indigenous movement was huge. But there was something different about that protest. And I think to some extent it was the class character. As Jean-Paul Stedgley, who's one of the top leaders of the MST, he talks about it as the working class weren't the main actors in these protests. It was really the middle class who were feeling the squeeze, the increasing squeeze of the middle class in Brazil as international capital was getting richer and richer and the redistribution was no longer possible, right? What was clear was that the downturn of the economies and the PT's pragmatic left, so the pragmatic left approach, was no longer possible. Another characteristic of these protests is that the right and the powerful entered them as well. And so the first 3 weeks, you see that media being against these protests, and you see the protests being about the anti-World Cup, but, should we wait for Michael to finish?
Well, it's been going for a while.
So if you follow the trajectory of these protests for the first 3 weeks, the media was against them and they were mostly calling for free public transportation. But after 3 weeks, suddenly the media began to support them and they were calling for the ousting of the PT and they were complaining about the corruption of the Workers' Party, right? And so you have this shift where there's hundreds of thousands of people out, but the right is also out there and they're really trying to dominate the discourse and try to make the discourse anti the Workers' Party government, right? So activists in Brazil called the June 2013 protest movement. He said, the movement is a battlefield. It highlights all of the contradictions of Brazilian society. There is no political force on the left that could articulate any alternative to the current status quo. While it is possible that the movement ends with a right-wing consolidation, its future is really in the air, right? So does everyone get that? So in 2013, the youth, the middle class, they take to the streets. Some working class people do. The right enter, and these movements are a political battlefield, right? This quote, I think, foreshadows what's to come in 2015. So, and this will be my last section, and then we'll be good. So in 2015, this year, on March 15th and on April 12th, about 200,000, 300,000 people took to the streets again. This time for a united call. While the 2013 protests were sort of diverse calls for various things, the 2015 protests were a united call for the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. Protesters could be heard calling for the impeachment and calling for military intervention already. Ja means like now, military intervention now. So these protesters, are so angry at the president that they were calling for a coup a la 1964 that would oust her once again. The nominal reasons for these protests, have people heard about sort of these protests and the accusations against the president? So basically the nominal reasons for these protests are that the national oil company Petrobras had some kind of grafting schemes where some of the politicians and the employers of Petrobras were giving contracts to certain contract companies in favor of sort of corruption, just basic corruption, right? Grafting schemes. And so person after person in President Rousseff's government was sort of called out and had to resign. As of now, President Rousseff hasn't been implicated in any of these corruption scandals, but you have these prominent people throughout Brazil and in the United States saying that she's no longer able to govern. The Economist, I was so shocked when I said this, the Economist said, that's, The Economist? Yeah. This was like a few weeks ago, for many practical purposes, the PT is no longer in power, and nominally ruling left-wing Workers' Party no longer calls the shot in Brasilia, the capital. So basically the Economist is saying that the Workers' Party is no longer calling the shots, that they're no longer able to govern.
Who is, according to the Economist?
They just said that it wasn't Dilma, that it was all the other political forces in Brasilia. Yeah. So why this hostility? That's the question, right?
Also familiar, going against the neoliberal model.
Exactly. So some argue, that's your argument, that it's a conservative backlash against years of PT Workers' Party directed social policies, especially since extreme poverty, as you were pointing out, has been reduced drastically and minimum wage has doubled, right? Other people say that these protesters perceive themselves as engaged in a life or death struggle to protect Western civilization, right? narrowly understood as being sustained by the twin pillars of economic liberalism and cultural conservatism against the specter of a scheming authoritarian left. You'll have signs in these protests that say, Chega Paulo Freire, which is like enough of Paulo Freire, enough of Paulo Freire, right? So there's the idea that in Brazil, this communist legacy, this Marxism, this more overt Marxism in the United States is sort of is a threatening Western civilization. Michael?
There are some scenes in, I forget which part of the documentary, The Battle of Chile, but in 72 and 73, this extreme right-wing Catholic group called Tradition, Family, and Property, which is like this fascistic group. Do they have any presence in Brazil?
Which group?
It's called Tradition, Family, and Property.
I don't know.
TFP.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know, and I'm also, just to be clear, I spent years with the MST, and so I know a lot about them. These protests are sort of just general knowledge that I'm sharing with everyone, so we can all sort of think about them together. But I did for you all want to say who is actually in these protests of hundreds of thousands of people, who's actually in them. And so I got some statistics from the ones that happened on April 12th, just a month ago. And this is interesting because the age of the protesters is actually kind of in their 50s and 60s.
Wow.
Which, that doesn't seem, someone pointed this out at our last talk, that doesn't seem too weird in the United States because there's actually a lot of people in their 50s, 60s, the baby boomers. But in Brazil, it's actually a super young population, right? So the fact that the majority of the protesters were in their 50s and 60s really says something.
It's the Brazilian Tea Party.
The Brazilian Tea, but yeah. Well, look at this. This says Renda is income, so you can see that the income of the protesters is quite high. This is schooling. Look at that. Almost everyone is college educated at these protests. Almost everyone. And then core color, it's like dominantly white, right? So I think that sort of speaks to some of the content of the protesters, yeah?
So you're saying that 2013 protests had a different demographics than the 2015?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm saying that, if in my understanding, the 2013 protests were a battlefield, initially sort of a product of the contradictions of the Workers' Party government and a call for like public transportation and free housing, like some calling for some radical things, but it became a battlefield where the right entered and it was sort of a battle. And I'm saying currently these 2015 protests are a new manifestation of sort of right-leaning sectors.
People who took part in the 2013, are they taking part in these, like many?
I think a lot of them aren't right now. Plus the 2013 person was like a million people, and this is like 200,000. But I think there's people who weren't in the 2013 protests that have joined these 2015 protests in this united call against corruption, right? And again, that idea, military intervention now, like that's sickening, right? Like that's like people dying, right?
Yeah.
I just have to show one last graph here. So this is confidence in political parties. And you can see the political party people have the least confidence in at the April 12th protest was the Workers' Party, the PT. Interesting, the PSOL is actually more radical than the PT, and they have more confidence. And then the party they have the most confidence to is the Social Democratic Party, which is the oppositional party, which is sort of the conservative party in Brazil right now. Well, it is the conservative party in Brazil right now. A final graph I think is really interesting. These are the confidence of protesters in social movements and organizations. And you can see the social movement or organization that the protesters have the least confidence in of all the movements in the country is which one?
MST.
The MST, yeah. The MST is hated in Brazil right now because I think of its shift to contesting agribusiness and international capital, right?
But is this general public opinion or of the protest?
This is of the protesters on April 12th. All these graphs are of the protesters on April 12th. They're like 100,000 protesters.
I was just going to ask how much of a difference is there between, that you know of, between the protesters, their feelings versus the general public, particularly in relation to the MST right now. Like, how indicative of the general public is, the feeling toward the MST, how the protesters feel.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, this is skewed, right? So this is like a certain segment of the population that's highly educated, that's whiter, that has a higher income. And I think among that sort of percentage of the population, people very much hate the MST. The media portrays the MST as like a terrorist group that's destroying private property. I mean, it's very hard. Among working class people, I think you'll have various different opinions, right? Not all working class people support the MST either. They'll say that it's not okay to steal people's land, right? So there'll be that rhetoric. Yeah.
Does the MST have any orientation to or involvement in building PASOL?
So PASOL is the party that is probably one of the more radical parties in Brazil right now. So the MST is officially autonomous from political parties, but individuals within the MST, I know lots of individuals with the MST who are involved in PASOL organizing as sort of individuals. I know individuals in the MST who are very involved in Workers' Party organizing. I know individuals in the MST who always vote in branco, which is blank, because they don't agree with any of the parties right now in Brazil, right?
And what's that acronym stand for?
The PASOL,
Yeah.
the Socialist Party, Party Socialista, Liberation, yeah.
Do you know how much influence they have, PASOL, in Brazilian movements generally?
I think they're pretty involved in a lot of urban movements. Like, I don't think they're as involved in the rural areas, but I think there's a lot of PASOL organizing around the homeless movement and in a lot of different arenas. The sort of oppositional labor movement right now is aligned with the PASOL as well. So, yeah. Peter, and then Michael.
What's Bem pra Rua?
What?
Bem pra Rua? What is that?
Oh, Bem pra Rua. It's just a movement, like come to the streets. I don't even know like its origins. I don't know if it's like a general sort of call to come to the streets, but it must be.
At the most.
Yeah.
So it's right leaning.
Yeah, I think it might be like the social media calls to come to the streets,
Right.
and because it's
Got
sort
it.
of ambiguous, right? Okay, I have two more things I'm gonna say, and then I'll stop. So although these protests are very large, some people, actually my friend Gustavo who's there, he said that the protest was highly orchestrated and that there's very little organic ability among the right wing to sustain this mass mobilization. However, there's a new intellectual right.
That seems like very contradictory to me. On one hand, you're talking about spontaneity, and then you're talking about how they're highly orchestrated. And
I didn't say these were spontaneous though.
2013.
The 2015 protests were not spontaneous. They were very highly orchestrated or highly
by
organized.
this right wing.
Yeah.
What?
By the right wing.
By the right wing.
Which
by
is Social Democratic Party?
Yeah, no, but it wasn't the PSD. It wasn't the Social Democratic Party that was calling for it. It was a group of people affiliated with that party, but a group of people that are trying to call for the impeachment of Dilma, right?
Yeah.
And so it's people from lots of different movements who are calling out the corruption that's currently happening in the Workers' Party and are calling for these protests. So I think it's an articulation of lots of different groups. And what people have said is that a lot of money is going into the So when I say it's organic, I think a lot of money is going into organizing. I think it's a lot of sort of political power and money power going into the organizing. Again, I'm not an expert in the 2015 protest. I've talked to a bunch of people about them, and that's the sense. There is this new intellectual right that I think is driving the fear among some middle class people also who maybe shouldn't have a stake in this sort of political project of the right. But it is this intellectual wing that's saying that communism, socialism, these social movements are creating sort of this backwards existence of Brazil, and that we have to go to modernity. We have to enter like the U.S. society where you can't speak the word socialism, basically, right? I mean, you can here, but it's a different political terrain. I think for me, one of the biggest issues with these protests is that it sort of forced the social movements that I've talked about that arose in the 1980s, who already had this contradictory relationship with the Workers' Party. It sort of forced them closer to the Workers' Party to defend them, right? So the MST, the MAT-SAT, which is the homeless movement, they've come out in support of the Workers' Party and a critique of these protests. And so that's perhaps necessary in the face of these accusations, but I think the left in Brazil really has this sort of contradictory relationship to the Workers' Party that still needs to be worked out. And I really like, I'm going to end on this, Oliveira, who's a theorist in Brazil. He says the key question is, can the left find a voice that is both steadfastly critical of the PT's transgressions and engaging as this new right? And so that's sort of the question for Brazil right now, I think. That's all. Thank you.